Thank you. Right, and good. It worked first time. That's always good. That's the first hurdle done. So, thank you for having me. And what I'm here to talk to you about today is a bit of a sort of imaginary scenario, but one that could become very real in the drone networks of the near future, which is if we're using something like 5G to control drone networks and coordinate traffic in the future, what safety cases do we need to take into account? What attacks might occur against those networks? And most of all, how do we safely get our drones home once we've ceased doing deliveries or other operations? So a little bit of background on me first. Well, already been introduced. I'm Darren Hurley-Smith. I'm a senior lecturer in the Smart Card Security Centre and the S3 lab within the Information Security Group at Royal Holloway. And I teach security testing. So I do a lot of activities that are more in line with the active CTF and red team activities that this group actually does. And so I do a lot of work with our students. I see a few of you in the audience who I've taught before. And we focus on practical activities, practical attacks, and effectively, when you take a real-world system and you put it in the context of exposing it to the public, exposing it to either sort of benign activity that forces it into an error state or more purposeful malicious activity, what actually happens to the surrounding systems and your expectations of how things should work. My research interests include dynamic task allocation, so I'm quite interested in the problem of, if I've got 100 of these and I've got 1,000 parcels, how do I do the traveling salesman problem with a big rotating device with knives that keep it in the air? So you've got a very dangerous device. You've got a critical case because you might be delivering things like insulin. You might be delivering blood. A lot of the last mile delivery scenarios that we're going to be looking at isn't going to be things like Amazon and Google. It's going to be, if we have another lockdown, how do we get prescription medicines where they need to go quickly and safely? And so you do have these kind of health critical and infrastructure critical problems that we have to deal with. And dynamic task allocation is one way of dealing with that. Network security, obviously, I'll be discussing that more as we go through. And also looking at hardware security and privacy issues, not just of AI and drones, but wider IoT devices. So I do a lot of work in things like smart spaces. What data do they collect? How do they use that data? And how does AI shape how we build next generation systems and how we interact with our applications? Before I go on to the main topic, none of the work that I do currently would be possible without the on-the-drone facility. We do a lot of work where obviously the Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA, as I refer to them throughout this presentation, would quite rightly frown at, because using coordinated swarms of drones or autonomous swarms of drones is quite rightly not allowed in public airspace, especially not this close to Heathrow. And so this facility has actually allowed us to do a whole variety of different problems in a contained environment. And this is key, you know. I can't be giving you a presentation on drone safety and how we actually use security to ensure safety and vice versa, unless I actually tell you how we do this safely to start with. So this is a facility that has, well, it's been in the progress for about 2 years, and we've recently constructed this facility this year. This is a 38 meter by 18.5 by 10 meter high hangar. And so you can actually fit quite a nice variety of small drones in there. You can use it for autonomous vehicle testing. In fact, very, very small at the top there. You can see our little autonomous vehicle hiding up the top. It's about the size of a sort of a two-seat coupe. And we can also use the space for what we call a Vicon system, which is basically a high-speed camera array that allows us to track objects through space. So I'm going to be talking about network protocols today. I'm going to be talking about the safety implications of those, but we're actually doing work to analyze the very real physical effects of what goes wrong when you have a misallocation of tasks or if network security breaks down and drones start operating in unexpected ways. So that's just a little introduction to the facility. Quite happy to take more questions about that afterwards, but I don't want to keep Nick waiting, so I'll get on with the main topic. Or maybe I'll go on to equipment. So yeah, as you can see, I brought one of our toys with us here. So we have this, this is a Matrice 300. I'm going to get into why I bought this with us because it's a really, really nice, it's just a good prop to gesture to and talk about the safety cases and, for example, the kind of payloads that you might expect the drones to carry. But we also have a variety of submarines and autonomous vehicles, as well as smaller drones that are used by geographers, health scientists, and other people within the university to do a variety of different studies. So again, happy to take any questions on this at the end. So let's get back to the topic at hand, drones in urban airspace. It's something you probably hear a lot about, but see next to nothing. And at the minute, the existence of drones in urban airspace is Usually it's going to be tradesmen, you're going to have builders, surveyors, law enforcement, maybe emergency services, and it's going to be someone with, in the case of law enforcement or fire, one of these and one of these. So right now, if you want to operate a drone in urban airspace, it's one-to-one. You need an A2 CFC or preferably and a GVC qualification. And in some cases, you need special permission from the CAA to operate. So you can do missions, but right now it's a very restricted, human-centric way. And that's how we manage safety. You've got someone to blame, you've got your trained person on the ground, so worst case scenario, you've got someone to blame. Preferably, you've got someone with the skills to safely operate that drone. However, that's not going to be the case forever. We're getting closer and closer to this idea of having beyond visual line of sight control of drones and using drones to solve problems and allow better transport of materials and, well, materiel through cities. So we've got several problems that we need to solve. If we're going to get away from, one person, one drone, how do we do that? Well, first we have to solve the problem of drone coordination. So if we have a swarm of drones, it doesn't matter if your company is only operating one drone and you're making one delivery with a parcel, you exist in a bigger world than that. You have many, many drones in the air at the same time. You have to share that airspace. You have to utilize it. So we need to route the physical traffic. So we need some form of air traffic control. And you also need to be able to understand how you would complete your objectives. So where's your parcel going? How are you going to get there? Negotiate with local air traffic control about how you're going to get there safely and avoiding any no-go zones. Because, well, London, for example, is a patchwork of no-fly zones, and those might be enforced even for autonomous networks. And then finally, maintaining situational awareness for beyond visual line of sight or BVLOS operations. So currently, if I want to fly this, I have to be able to see it. If I fly out of my line of sight, I'm now flying illegally. Obviously, if you're dealing with an autonomous system of drones in a city, you've got so many physical obstacles in the way that there is no human possible way, even with CCTV, that you're going to track these all the time. And so now we need ways of getting situational awareness from the collective swarm itself, so both the drone and its sensors. So we got a little, this is called an FPV camera. So basically first-person view camera in the front here, possibly a gimbal-mounted camera on the bottom, and the aggregate of all of the drones collecting that information and sharing it and forwarding it to the air traffic control is how you maintain your situational awareness. So basically imagine it like the cameras and the drones are providing sensors in the same way that the sensors on the aircraft do to their air traffic control. Of course, you've got a dialogue with the pilots in traditional air traffic control. In this case, you're just running off of the sensor data and making sure that everyone's flying within tolerance. So we've got some safety issues to consider because, well, I've raised the spectre of actual air traffic. Obviously, safety is a huge case. Before you even take off, you've got dozens of checklists. You've got many, many items you need to consider. And so safety issues here is we need data required for dynamic updates. So safety case, one of your drones goes off plan. So it's either moving slightly too fast, slightly too slow, or going into a high occupancy area where you want to route drones through a gap between buildings, for example. You now need the other drones in that area to alert you. We have someone who's not complying with the mission plan. The ability to inform that drone, like, are you sure you are where you say you are? Are you receiving bad GPS data? Have you lost your GPS lock? Here are some coordinates and instructions on what to do. And you need to have the telemetry and the communications infrastructure to support that exchange of information. So drones aren't going to fly themselves. Even something as big as this, and delivery drones get much, much bigger than this, they are not smart enough to fly themselves in a complex environment. If you just went above the city, you'd be fine. The problem is you've got a flight ceiling of, I think it's 120 meters, 400 feet. That might be lifted, but in London it's unlikely. You've got too many airports and too many potential collisions. And so you've got a complex environment of buildings. Buildings aren't going to talk back to you, and so you need air traffic control to tell you where they are if you can't detect them anymore and how to avoid them. So the main reason I'm bringing all of this up is it gives you an idea of exactly how complex this problem is. The actual problem is very simple. You don't want to collide with anything. The problem is you've got so many sensors, so many different ways in which you can collide with things, and you've got your full 6 degrees of freedom that you need to worry about, because it's not just going into a building from the front, the back, or the sides. You could also ascend into a building if you're moving under an archway. You could descend into a bad situation. For example, emergency landing in the middle of a road, probably a very bad idea. So it all comes down to this final point, which is we have all the sensors on the drone because I can operate the drone. I can fly on telemetry. I understand where the drone is. I can locate it in space. I can set up automated missions. So the data definitely exists. The problem is when we have many, many hundreds, possibly thousands of them, how do we communicate to coordinate? So some examples of delivery drones. Of course, I've got the matrice. It's carrying a camera in that case, so it's more of like emergency service drone. This might be operating in the same space, but there's nothing stopping you putting the basket on the bottom, loading it with parcels up to about 2 kilos. So this is on the lower end of delivery drone. If you're thinking of delivery drones, you could use things like Mavic Minis and much smaller drones, but that's going to be sort of delivering very, very small parcels. So maybe sort of ampules of insulin, things along those lines. If you're delivering anything of substance, it's going to be something this size at least. And so that means you have, at full capacity, a 9-kilogram drone in the air, which, as you can imagine, has a substantial amount of kinetic energy if it decides to head straight downwards. So the rotors turn off and it crashes. That's a potential hazard. Yeah? A very, very bad potential hazard, because that will either gravely injure someone or destroy a car, for example. So you've got that risk to think about initially. You've also got these much larger designs. So these are more long haul. So the two on the left-hand side of the presentation there, from your perspective, those are more sort of long-haul intercity transport. So I think the top one is proposed by, that's Prime Air. So that's a Prime Air prototype that's used for basically transporting between sort of suburban areas or conurbations. It's got a range of about 20 miles, so it can go a fair distance and still get home, whereas something like this, you're looking at maybe 50 minutes of airtime, maximum speed of 48 miles an hour. So you're quite limited in scope by comparison, and that's why last mile delivery is the main focus. There's also, that's a FedEx payload on a wing drone at the bottom. So this is a third-party manufacturer that's looking at designs for long-haul, high endurance. So in this case, delivering a large amount of FedEx parcels between warehouses. And then we've got our tiny little drones down here. We need to be aware of the fact that we still may have individually piloted drones in an area where autonomous drones are. Yeah. We might be able to legislate and turn around and say, well, in an autonomous drone area, you're not allowed to operate your tiny little drones. It's vanishingly unlikely, because these tools are increasingly useful for insurance appraisal, repairing buildings, and monitoring traffic. So you will have manned transport in the area as well. So applications, I'll keep this short. There are many, yeah. Largely artistic in many cases, so smaller drones are used for photography, videography, monitoring, usually visual sensing tasks. A drone like this, you can mount thermal cameras, LiDAR, a whole variety of different sensors. We've even got ground-penetrating radar where you can hover 2 meters above the ground and actually get GPR over uneven surfaces now, which is actually being used in areas like volcanic excavations in Greece. So they've recently found that old lava fields, if you take a normal GPR unit over it, it's shaking around all over the place, you get really bad readings. With a drone, you can get a nice smooth reading over that rough surface and identify whether it's worth digging in an area. In an urban situation, you might be using GPR to monitor the health of bridges and things along those lines, mounted on vehicle or mounted on drone. So you've got all these varieties of different applications. We're going to focus on deliveries to keep it simple, because I'm going to start scoping this talk in and talking very specifically about this one safety scenario, because I've given you the wider context. So let's think about a delivery scenario. So current consumer grade drones, if we want to satisfy these communication requirements of sharing information, well, we've got a 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz multiband radio on here, but there's nothing stopping me popping open one of these little ports on the top and attaching a software-defined radio, 5G module, or even a cellular module of my choice, possibly even satellite communications, although it won't have the power to get back, so it'll only receive communications. Currently, this is used to establish a pairwise one-to-one link. So, this important thing down here, right now I am the controller of the drone. However, there is nothing stopping you using the radio interface as any traditional wireless interface. You know, you're using basically standard Wi-Fi. So we can form a Wi-Fi mesh between drones. We can form a Wi-Fi mesh with local infrastructure. As I said earlier, we can also plug in expansion modules and attach to any other infrastructure we would like. 5G integration is being planned. NATs are specifically talking, so National Airways are talking specifically about using 5G because it has the bandwidth requirement to allow full dumps of telemetry in high definition. This is important for liability and safety reasons because, first of all, for liability, you basically want to have a virtual black box. Yeah? The drone might be destroyed by an accident, which means you're not going to get a black box recording on the drone. To make sure that you have that liability requirement, storing all of the telemetry from that drone, either air traffic control or a third-party service, is a high priority. Also, you just want the bandwidth to be able to communicate on top of receiving all of that sensor data. It's also possible to implement a mobile ad hoc network So a mesh, as I mentioned earlier, that allowed drones to share information more locally with lower bandwidth. And this will be important as we go through the conversation. Let's look at our second requirement that I highlighted earlier, beyond visual line of sight. So I'm no longer looking at my controller, I am not looking at the telemetry, the drone is being guided by algorithm instead of by people. So National Air Traffic Services, NATS, have published a white paper detailing BV loss considerations. They used to use the phrase human equivalent sensing. That has been proven to be too general, because it turns out humans have quite a diverse array of sensing capabilities. For example, mine degrades significantly if I do this. So taking into account the diversity of how humans experience space around them and process information, well, using that as a baseline for how you control a system is actually pretty difficult. Also, I mean, we still have accidents with humans controlling drones. And so the safety case now is more about satisfying safety requirements that drones could precipitate or be involved in or directly cause, and trying to ensure those do not occur. The reason this is relevant to security is many of those cases can be caused maliciously or be caused by misconfiguration of the underlying hardware. And that's what I'll be looking at specifically as cases in which people might want to try and either attack your service or stop it from functioning in some other way. So BV loss requires that operators receive real-time telemetry and visual data from their drones for both liability reasons, as I've already explained, but also to allow decision-making. For example, if you have a whole variety of drones that are able to identify a point of interest, let's say Big Ben, and a drone like this one, near Big Ben, but the GPS on this drone is malfunctioning and telling us that it's sort of several meters, possibly even hundreds of meters displaced from its position, we can now enforce on that drone and say, ATC will take direct control of you, you don't know where you are, we have identified where you are, we've identified a safe landing location, you're going to be guided there and suspend the rest of your tasks. So that's one example of a safety case where a drone has lost control of its own navigation, can't tell where it is, and can be guided by the use of collective sensors to identify where it should land. This is relatively complex, but we've already mentioned we will use 5G to support the large amount of data required. So drones must be able to detect and be detected. So I showed you that small drone earlier, like the Parrot Anafi down in this corner here. That doesn't really have any of those abilities. It's got a camera on the front, but it has no collision sensors, it doesn't have any LiDAR, it doesn't have the ability to tell whether other drones are in the area. And so again, this is why I brought this drone with me, because this really does represent the minimum specification that you're looking for in a delivery drone. Trustworthy communications infrastructure and a governing body is also required, because we could try and form sort of a direct democracy consensus about how our airspace is used, but that will probably take quite a while and change quite frequently. So it's really, really good to know what rules are being enforced. And well, NATS provides a nice governing body for this by providing the safety guidelines. They might not provide the ATC, but they'll definitely tell you what is and is not allowed. For trustworthy communications, well, 5G infrastructure is part of our backbone telecommunications infrastructure now. We have companies like Arqiva and Telefonica. They provide those background services and have a wide variety of experience in what kind of failure can occur, how you maintain that infrastructure, and how it is used. You could develop third-party infrastructure, so like National Highways, for example, have the NERTs networked for coordinating all of their roadside sensors, but that kind of begs the question of, well, we've already got all these 5G masts, why don't we just rent time on those instead and use those if we're able to maintain a secure service? If you want to go to the link there, that will provide you the, as of March 23, current NATS guidelines on flying beyond visual line of sight and using 5G to allow for remote sensing in real time. So we've got our real time, so we can get past our beyond visual line of sight requirement because we now have a real-time telemetry, like big scare quotes real time. You're going to get latency in sort of the millisecond range, but that's acceptable. Yeah? If we're operating in the millisecond range, we can avert crisis, we can make sure everything works properly. We've also talked about communications requirements, and now we're going to merge those and look at the problem of air traffic control, which is assuming we can avert crisis and we can use information to coordinate our drones. How do we actually divide up airspace and use it properly? Because it's not going to be as simple as we do task allocation, we figure out where 100 drones are going to deliver 1,000 different parcels, and then it's just a free-for-all where everyone picks an altitude, picks a line, and just goes in a straight line. That's clearly not going to work, because even if you do have the ability to deconflict in real time, why take the chance of having to trigger your deconfliction and collision avoidance when you could just plan to avoid that to begin with and make that the exception rather than the rule? So air traffic control is required to support any use case. Yeah? We consider a centralized ATC using 5G. The reason we consider this is you then have a central form of reporting, central black box for your liability and your recording scenarios. And also, you don't end up with contention over how the airspace is used. If you're in a given jurisdiction's airspace, those rules apply, and the drones will be coordinated according to the ATC and be given occupancy of airspace as required. Urban and intercity drone networks may require real-time telemetry, incident reporting, flight plan enforcement, and BVLOS integration. So if you're doing any travel between cities, you might be passing between jurisdictions, so you need to deconflict those rules. That's outside the scope of this talk, but there's quite a lot of interesting material on that we can talk about afterwards. Flight plan enforcement, again, if you're going to fly between cities, you need to deconflict that. We're going to look at the specific scenario of operating within a hypothetical city, one jurisdiction, and how that operates. How that operates, well, authorities must be able to monitor and communicate with these drones. Yeah? Enforcement's nothing if you don't have the ability to actually enforce what you are asking to do. That means they must have a higher level of privilege than the operators themselves, or the ability to inform operators that they need to instruct the drones to act in a certain way. So we're looking at a tiered system here. Operators tell their drones what missions need to be achieved. Air traffic tells them how they use airspace to achieve them. And so there's this back and forth communication. So we've now got the drone looped in, the drone operator, in this case maybe FedEx or Amazon or some other company, and we have the air traffic control. And all three of these are required to make sound decisions. So we're getting to the main problem now. We're on slide 11. We're getting into the actual meat of this. And we have the assumptions. So this is a hypothetical scenario, but it is based on sound research. It's based on a study of existing regulations and the NATS guidelines. And it is also based on actual empirical data of operating mesh networks over drones. And so I feel these are safe assumptions to make, but again, happy to hear any dissenting voices and have a debate afterwards. So the CAA does not permit the use of autonomous drone swarms at present. So assumption number one, that has changed. Yeah. Currently, the CAA would make us do an experiment like this in an enclosed area for obvious safety reasons, but we're assuming that we've got these deconfliction services. We have the high bandwidth required to basically make sure we don't have mid-air collisions. So for this talk, we must assume that a consensus has been formed either at a local or national level regarding what telemetry constitutes either human equivalent sensing or, as I said earlier, basically safety case compliant sensing. So at the very minimum, we need the ability to see that a collision is about to happen. Appropriate infrastructure such as 5G integration and appropriate local ATC is present, so you have enough bandwidth to shuttle all of this data around, and a sufficiently sophisticated central controller to make sure that routes are prescribed and enforced. Many-to-many networking is enabled on drones. So as I said, right now, if I delink this from the drone, you can add another controller to the drone. That is a clear one-to-one enforcement in software on the drone itself. It can be overridden, but you're in violation of several CAA safety cases if you do. However, we're assuming that those rules have changed, and you're no longer caring about this. This is now represented by the air traffic control. And so although you have a central point of control, that control may come from any number of 5G towers or other points. And so you need this many-to-many relationship. This will also come in handy when we talk about the backup scenario. Drone operators have permission to conduct missions. So you are an operator. As you can see on the front, there's this little serial number on the drone. This is my operator ID that gives me permission to operate within the open category. So we've got several different types of mission I can fly with the drone. In this case, we assume there'll be a separate licensing system where an operator can get a license to operate deliveries using drones. So with those assumptions in place, let's move on to the problem statement, which is drone deliveries are allowed under condition of supervision by the ATC, for the deconfliction rules and the safety cases I talked about earlier. That ATC uses static infrastructure, such as 5G, so basically big mast, to support telemetry and control traffic. Telemetry includes video, inertia measurements, GPS, and other drone state information that is of use to aid in navigation. Control traffic, so information either going to the drones or from drones to infrastructure, includes task allocations. So to delegate out what airways are being used, you need to know where the drones want to go. Flights and routes and restrictions, so what flight routes are being prescribed based on the stated needs of drones and the current occupancy of those routes. and bidirectional status updates. So are you still within the lane that has been given to you? Are you straying into, say, opposite traffic, for example? So if we assume you've got an airway where you've got sort of two-way traffic, obviously you want to monitor that you're staying in your lane. So let's have a look at the task allocation issue to start with, yeah? And this is very, very simple. You've got a drone, you want to pick up you want to basically get to a location where you pick up a parcel. So you've got a parcel assigned to you, you want to move it to a location, and you want to drop off. Move to location is the state you are going to spend the longest time in. It's also the state that triggers the most replans, because you might have to change airways, so you've got replanning for the use of airspace. But you also got replanning for, well, if the parcel can't be delivered, so someone, for example, turns around and says, sorry, I'm not going to be in, I can't pick it up, well, you might have to abandon that delivery or move it somewhere else. And so you have all of these in-air replans that can occur. So the safest states for you to be in are basically parcel pickup, because you can designate an area for pickup, and parcel drop off, because you have a clear designated area to drop the parcel. So we're going to think mostly about this moving to location state. We have drones in motion and in the air. So to get those drones in the air to start with, we have a simple delivery system that must solve the following problems and transition through the three states that I talked about earlier, which is we assign parcels to drones, assign or infer from parcel data, so either from a database, you can turn around and say this is the data associated with this parcel, or the drone just scans a QR code or barcode and infers where the GPS coordinates for the delivery are. And then you receive your delivery locations. You then need to travel to the pickup and travel to the drop-off. You must validate delivery of the parcels, so that's another bit of telemetry, but that's operator specific, not safety case specific. And where battery life allows, return to step one. So in this case, you've got 55 minutes. You might be able to do 2 or 3 deliveries depending on how close the locations are to each other and how much each one weighs. We can choose to assign tasks in a centralized or decentralized manner. Don't worry, we will get to this later, but right now we've got a perfectly good 5G infrastructure, so why would an operator not just simply schedule things? Reduce your communication complexity, you don't allow drones to make decisions, you have either experts or an AI telling you exactly where you need these parcels to go, and so we are just going to designate by fiat which drone picks up what parcel and where it goes. That is supported by our current expectation of what the ATC relies on and what the drone operator relies on. We have some limitations to task allocation, however, which is with task allocated, drones now have destinations picked and are ready to pick up their parcels. However, task allocation does not inform drones how to get to their destination, manage air traffic, or deconflict the use of airspace. So they tell me where I need to go, but not how to get there. We don't trust operators to manage air traffic as they may be in competition. So I've already talked about the fact that we're going to delegate this to ATC. This is just some additional context saying, if you've got Amazon and FedEx in competition or any delivery company, there may be some sort of preference for their hardware over others, especially if they're dominant within an area. So to ensure fairness, ATC designates airspace. Airspace is not owned by individuals. This may age incredibly poorly if you're watching the recording, because we don't know how airspace is actually going to be divided up. My assumption is local authority will control it. So you've got this local conflict resolution problem. I've introduced the ATC and the BVLOS situation. And ATC provides centralized support for flight planning and management, including designation and enforcement of private airspace, designating routes based on the stated needs of drones, so the data coming back from the drones, and also dynamic updates of airspace states. So, for example, has there been a traffic accident? You definitely won't want drones flying over while there's a traffic accident, because the police might have their drones in the area, fire services might have their drones in an area, or they might be operating heavier machinery or even helicopters. And so you will have these dynamic updates that need to be reconciled. ATC handles all of these. So we get to our scenario, back to the title of this presentation. I've set this expectation up. I've built this world where we have ATC providing this level of control, we have task allocation performed by operators and airspace delegated by local authorities via the ATC. However, there is the possibility of infrastructure outage. So floods, for example, are absolute murder on telecommunications infrastructure, largely because, well, they occur on the ground. A lot of the power infrastructure for telecoms is on the ground or under the ground, and water getting into it is generally a bad time for everyone involved in that. And so the loss of 5G is something that's very real that we have to consider. Yeah, it may be like if you're substantially above sea level, you're mostly worried about one or two going out, whereas if you are susceptible to periodic seasonal floods, you might be seeing like the crippling of telecoms infrastructure on a seasonal basis. And so this is something that must be considered. Also, even if you are relatively safe, it's a safety case you must consider because there is every opportunity for a large-scale 5G outage. For example, telecommunications infrastructure isn't just vulnerable to power loss, it may also be attacked by cyber attack. You might have routing attacks, DDoS attacks, other incidents which mean that you do not get the service requirements that we established earlier in this presentation. So this leaves us with some very urgent problems. Dynamic updates of airspace may no longer be trustworthy. Either they're too slow, so they're out of resolution, or the 5G medium itself may have become untrusted due to junk traffic or direct injection of misleading traffic into that environment. Enforcement of airspace usage and allocation of new routes may no longer be available. Telemetry and log recording is also now limited to the drones themselves. So we run into that black box problem I talked about earlier, which is if the black box is destroyed, so it falls a large distance and you can no longer recover information from it, a lot of your liability and insurance models start to fall apart. And so we've no longer got our virtual black box. What do? We focus on getting home safely. We can't land where we are, and we don't want to blindly proceed home, so we have this bigger problem to solve, and we need to do it in the absence of all of that high bandwidth and high technology that we talked about so far. So we can't simply send drones home because we end up with the same problem I described earlier on, which is you've got all of your parcels, why not just go as fast as you can to your individual locations and try and drop your parcels off? Surely going as the crow flies is more efficient. Well, not if you count mid-air collisions as a problem. And so we got the same problem returning home, which is a lot of these drones will be converging on similar locations. This is no longer just an issue of, well, we can just scatter and land in safe places. Home, for many of these, is going to be a warehouse, which means at some point they will be flying in close proximity or possibly using the same routes for quite a distance. So sending drones home without consensus regarding the use of airspace presents a grave risk of collision. Also, landing in place represents a safety hazard. Just because 5G's out doesn't mean the rest of the world stops. You have pedestrians, you have cars, public transport. Your drone might be in the middle of a railway for all you know. And so, sure, you could turn around and say, oh, well, go to the top of the nearest building or things along those lines. That makes the assumption that all drones are capable of making that decision on their own and capable of making that determination in the absence of central control. We can't make that assumption. So the safest thing is, you know where home is. You took off from there. You've got the GPS coordinates. Go back there, but coordinate with drones in the local area to try and deconflict and avoid collisions on the way there. So this is all done in the absence of central control. The assumption here is central control has collapsed. And we're now just trying to make sure that we maintain safety and prevent an attack from turning into something cyber-physical. So the entire purpose of knocking out 5G might be to endanger aerial assets, or that might just be a side effect. But our case now is to try and stop that attack from turning from an initial cyber attack into something more physical and more dangerous. So we have task allocation. We've already used task allocation for sending out parcels, and I did mention a big problem with that earlier, which is we can't use that to delegate out air traffic routes. We can't use that to tell people where to go because that's an air traffic control problem. However, air traffic control's collapsed. Now we can use task allocation to turn around and say, we know, so the drones do all have onboard maps, what the local lie of the land is. For example, do I need to pass through an archway with a maximum occupancy of 2 drones, one in one direction, one in the other direction? Do I know that there's a small space that I need to pass through that will bring me within separation distance of another drone? And so you can start to dynamically set up tasks between the drones that specifically say, occupancy in this area will basically be a new navigation task, so say a pickup task where you don't have to land. You go to that location and just continue following the waypoints. So we can repurpose the original task allocation protocol for parcel delivery to set up waypoints in space instead. This means that although the air traffic rules have broken down, we can have a set of hard-coded rules on the drones that allow them to make some very basic decisions about who can occupy space at what time, and they can use their own battery levels to determine who gets priority, because obviously someone running lower on battery needs to get somewhere faster. We can repurpose existing network interfaces. I mentioned 2.4 and 5 gigahertz radio. You might even have software-defined radio. You can establish a mesh. because you can implement a software router on the drone itself, or even a hardware router in next generation drones, and just use 2.4 and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi to set up a simple mesh between them. Some of you who are more familiar with these technologies might already be seeing when the other shoe is going to drop here, which is that represents huge security risks. Mesh is known to be insecure. So we have no choice but to use decentralized task allocation to solve the first problem, and we have no real solution other than to use mesh, because you don't have infrastructure to talk to. You could hypothesize that there could be a public Wi-Fi, for example, that you could connect to, or things along those lines. That represents even more security risks, and if we're talking about infrastructure outage, we have not got a defined scope. Our scenario assumes complete infrastructure outage. You just don't have anyone that you can contact other than mobile assets in the air. So, a quick overview of the task allocation protocol, and I will keep this relatively simple. The main problem we have with task allocation is that if you do like traditional round robin, so you no longer have a commander telling you what to do. You don't have ATC instructing like this, then this, then this, then this, then this. That means you need to use some form of decentralized task allocation where you reach consensus. And the problem is many auction algorithms, like consensus-based bundle algorithm, do a round robin approach. They use the one thing you don't have, which is time. Yeah? If you're going to, well, I've got a few graphs to show you how long it takes in a moment, but let's say you've got as few as 18 drones, you could be looking at task allocation problems with, say, 50 tasks, so 50 waypoints that you need to share between drones, taking upwards of about 1.5 minutes, which doesn't sound like much time, but remember, you've only got 55 minutes of airtime. You could be down to half or less than that, and it starts to make up a substantial proportion of the amount of time that you are in the air is now spent hovering, waiting for a replan. This is per replan. So that means if a situation changes, if a drone reports a different state, if a new drone moves into the area and needs to be involved, you might trigger another replan, which means you end up with a longer wait, a longer wait, a longer wait each time. So we need to resolve this quickly so that we can resolve a replan and act on it before the next one occurs. The simplest way of doing this is trying to form local clusters. So basically, using a combination of the mesh networking protocol I'll talk about in a moment, and also just local identification of drones, so basically pinging, broadcasting Wi-Fi and returning signals back to identify how many drones you have in an area and segmenting the network appropriately. So in this kind of algorithm, drones bid on tasks using an auction algorithm. They use remaining battery life as currency. So I mentioned earlier, you've got lower battery life, which means you need to get somewhere fast. Also, if you're closer to a location, you should probably head there first. And so drones use their battery life to say, I have this much battery life to perform tasks. That means I can support a more circuitous route. Yeah? So a drone with more battery might be able to move out of the way with drones with less, take a longer route back home, just to make sure that they don't pass through danger zones where a load of drones with low battery all want to go in the same area. So it's a good way to diffuse your assets, and basically make sure you don't collide, and make the most use of battery to allow you to spread out in space rather than all trying to go through pinch points. Lowest bidder wins each task. As I said, if you're closer, the better. Yeah? If you have more battery, we can add a weight to that, saying there is a tax on your bids to make sure that if you have a lot of battery life, but you are the closest, it becomes slightly more expensive if you're in conflict with other drones, so that we have a tiebreaker between a drone with low battery and a drone with high battery. This requires multiple rounds to reach consensus, and that is where the time lag runs in. So this diagram mostly just walks you through, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but it just walks you through the basic auction process at the high level and shows that what we actually want to do is at the high level distribute tasks between segments. So identify, say, a multi-mile area, distribute tasks among cluster heads of drones in that area, and then identify groups of drones that are in clusters and deal with local problems rather than trying to solve every routing problem for every drone in the area. This means that we can actually solve the allocation algorithm before we end up with a dynamic replan, and we can actually start moving. So our rationale for clustering in this case is the solid line at the top of figure 1 shows the amount of time it takes for 18 unclustered robots to solve this problem. So in this case, let's look at 50 tasks with 18 robots. We are looking at in the region of 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes to solve that problem. Whereas if we have clusters of robots, these are an order of magnitude faster. This is because you have less drones involved in the decision making. Now the cost of this is that their assignments are less optimal. They use battery life less efficiently because when you cluster, you might end up with a cluster full of drones that are less suited for the tasks that are being allocated. So if you've got a route back home and you've got a cluster right at the other end of the city, obviously they're going to have a large amount of high cost allocations. But as long as we have sufficient battery to reach safely, optimality isn't the issue. It is the speed of resolving the problem in a way that results in no conflicting paths, which is the most important thing. Optimality matters when you want to deliver multiple parcels. When you just want to get home, as long as you get home, efficiency doesn't matter so much. So to support this kind of task allocation, which I have gone over fairly briefly, we need our communication protocol. So we've got our mesh communications here. And what we want to do is implement routers on all drones. Well, fortunately, we've already got them. So we've got our routers on this drone. And we want to implement a mobile ad hoc network routing protocol. Yeah, we can't use an internet-based protocol because we don't have internet infrastructure. Every drone is a router, every drone is an endpoint. And mesh networking provides this capability. So we can use the existing radio, or we can implement an SDR, but we may as well use the existing radio in this scenario. In a traditional AODV multipath, so AODV is a reactive ad hoc on-demand distance vector protocol, each drone, when they want to communicate with each other, beacons out a request to communicate with a specific drone in the area, either by IP address or another identifier, and will receive a response from that drone saying either I am a direct neighbor to you, or each drone will pass on that request until eventually you reach the appropriate drone and it back propagates down that line. We're going to look at a different scenario to this one, which is proactive protocols. So I've got a proactive diagram on the next page, but in proactive protocols, what you do is instead of making a request to contact a specific person, you send out hello messages. You say, here I am, constantly. So that you raise awareness that you exist in a space and maintain contact with directly connected drones that can then inform other drones that they have a direct line of communication to you. So this allows us to form a changing, self-regenerating network in the area. And these protocols have been around for many decades now. Mostly it's the security issues, which are the ongoing work. So MANET protocols define the processes and rules by which a group of nodes can act as both endpoints and routers. They can be proactive or reactive, as I've described. And we're going to focus on proactive because we want maximum awareness of drones in an area. So we want them to announce themselves very early on. The other benefit of proactive is rerouting is much faster. AODV provides more stable routes because it's got a more heavyweight routing process and more defined routing tables. Proactive protocols, you suffer from more link breakage, but if you just want to transmit messages quickly, you can make those connections quickly and pass that information on very quickly. We're going to discard hybrid protocols at this stage. Largely because, well, I just don't have the data to back it up because I've not been working on them, but also they tend to inherit the worst of both worlds as well as the best. And in our case, speed is everything. We want to converge on a solution quickly. Quick shout out to the Batman protocol, which is a modern extension of the ULSA protocol. And ULSA is a reactive protocol, a proactive protocol. It's one of the first ones that was developed. Batman is a Linux extension, so if you have Ubuntu installed or any more recent Debian, you've actually got Batman implemented on there already, and you can mess around with the network stack of your virtual machine or computer as you see fit and play around with it quite nicely. It's developed by Freifunk, and it's intended to make MANET routing more efficient. So it uses existing network interfaces more efficiently, is more power aware, and is also more aware of how local devices may communicate and how frequently they disconnect or reconnect. This is the very simple diagram I was telling you about earlier with proactive protocols. In this case, A announces its presence to the network simply by propagating an originator message, or OGM. And that says OGM A goes to B, OGM A goes to C. Their job is to beacon that out again. Yeah? So whenever they receive an OGM from another node, what they do is they propagate that, but they put a number on the end of it saying, I'm sending out an OGM from A. This is A's identifier, and now I'm going to increment the hops by 1 to tell you that if you, D, have received OGM A, you are 2 hops away from A. So A, 0, 1 to B, 2 to D. Yeah? Nice and visual there. It just allows the drones to then identify who they have to talk to in their locality to talk to any other drone in the network. And they only need to know who their nearest connected drone on that route is. They don't actually need to know where A is along that entire route as you would in AODV. So we have some issues to consider, and I'll start wrapping up soon. I'm quite near the end at this point, which is that Batman assumes perfect trust. Batman does not implement routing layer 3 security protocols. You've got no IPsec, nothing along those lines. Batman requires that packets remain small. This is so that you can suffer link breakage and recover at low cost. CMAC and other security fields will increase OGM size dramatically, but you can include them if you want. But that does mean you slow down the routing process. OGMs are also periodically flooded through the network. Large OGMs may cause line contention or highly connected drones. So what I mean by this is you might end up with a drone at the middle of a cluster over which all traffic from every drone around it passes, and that drone cannot process all that information, leading to a slowdown. Our problem is one of a vulnerable infrastructure, the MANET. The MANET is our new virtual infrastructure in this case. As a result, this routing protocol is vulnerable to a variety of attacks. So very quickly going over these, pseudo-spoofing, or more commonly known as the Sybil attack, is a simple theft of identity. And because you're now relying on OGMs to say, this is my IP address and I'm in this area, well, there's nothing stopping you spoofing an IP address and saying, well, actually, all of these drones around me, I'm going to use their identities and propagate OGMs in their name at a higher rate, which means that traffic will get routed to me rather than to them. And this allows you to then either sync the packets, reroute it, use it, gather data, and so on. It also is quite dangerous when you're trying to do replanning to return a whole bunch of drones home and deconflict any possible collisions on the way there. Black hole attacks are your more traditional sinkhole attacks. So you receive a packet, you just sync it. This does mean that if you end up with that oversubscribed node I talked about earlier, or you use pseudo-spoofing to attract traffic to yourself, you can destroy it, which then means you can't make decisions and it slows down task allocation or prevents it from occurring at all. And finally, wormhole attacks, where what you do is you have two colluding nodes, and what they do is, using either more powerful or more sophisticated communications, transport messages from one part of the network to the other, circumventing the standard rules of the MANET routing protocol. So for example, if you have a more high-powered radio, you might be able to communicate a longer distance than all of your local nodes and collude with another drone to identify where drones are for the purpose of theft or coordinating a larger attack. So these all represent operational risks. Pseudo-spoofing destroys trust, and you need trust to make task allocations. If you cannot trust that a drone will act on its stated allocation, well, then you can't do anything with them. You have to avoid them. Black hole attacks destroy communicated bids, preventing drones from participating in task allocation, and wormhole attacks allow malicious nodes to attract disproportionate traffic, and that can lead to either of the other two attacks being amplified in their scope. There's also the possibility of privacy risks. So these drones, some as small as 249 grams, capture 4K video at 30 frames per second minimum. As I said earlier, we want all of that information for our virtual black box and to report back to ATC. Well, now all of that data is being produced in the wild, and you may be able to send requests if, for example, you're pseudo-spoofing or performing a wormhole attack to route traffic, so that you can collect that information outside of the frameworks of the operators. So the operator might be a GDPR-certified data transport or data controller. The attacker probably isn't. And the attacker can now get access to window height or building height, or possibly in areas they shouldn't be, footage, and try and route that back out as a product of attacking the network. So there is this further privacy concern that I don't want to focus on in this talk, but I do want to highlight it for further conversation. So solutions, as we're moving towards the end of the talk. Well, first of all, Superman, as you might mention, might see, is inspired by Batman. So we've got better approach to mobile ad hoc networks. Well, now we've got security using pre-existing routing for mobile ad hoc networks, and this was actually an outcome of my PhD many years ago, which is in iteration still. So we're still working on this and developing it further. The benefit of using Batman, for example, as a basis, or any other MANET routing protocol, is it fundamentally modifies the network stack and allows us to insert arbitrary functionality into layer 3, so the routing layer. And so we can also use that as a way of distributing certificates or distributing keys. And so the idea here is OGMs are insecure. I can't trust what they are. They're not encrypted. There's no proof of identity. How do I, in a lightweight way, add trust to this through confidentiality and through authentication without completely overwhelming the underlying routing protocol? And so, first of all, we're protocol agnostic. It works better on reactive protocols, but that's only because reactive protocols send fewer beacon messages. They send a hello only when they want to talk to someone. However, it will work on any protocol. It increases the size of routing packets There's no avoiding that. This has a significant impact on proactive MANET's quality of service. However, your quality of service is 0 if you're under constant black hole and pseudo-spoofing attacks. So, you need to take your checks and balances and figure out what your use case actually is. Reactive MANET protocols with infrequent link breakage are less affected. However, we've already highlighted we have this need for awareness. Drones need to detect and be detected. One of the quickest ways to be detected is to broadcast your position constantly and ask for contact with other drones. And so we have to reject the reactive, even though it would be slightly more efficient for us in this case. It operates independently of manufacturer security services. So for example, this drone implements something called OcuSync for its telemetry. You can still apply that at the application layer, but this is purely concerned about securing the communication links themselves, not the application data itself. It provides source authentication, last hop authentication, and message integrity checks, and looks like this. So Superman, like Batman, modifies the Linux kernel network stack. It has end-to-end and peer-to-peer encapsulation. And this is important because if you only secure end-to-end, you do not have any guarantees of message integrity moving along the points. You don't have any chain of custody, for example, to tell you that you haven't had task allocations injected or any other form of payload manipulation. Node identifiers and security certificates are stored in a new security table, which is in the software implemented router on the drone itself. So you just figure out how much memory you've got, how much hard drive space you can call on if you want to do a more slow approach, and figure out how many entries you can have so that you can set up a local router that can then be used as a key store. This table includes session keys to support confidentiality of non-routing packets. So not only can you use this to then secure OGM, so you send out your initial OGM message, you can then create a secure tunnel between those two drones, and you now have a session key between those two drones, but furthermore, you can set up a broadcast key where as soon as those tunnels are created between drones individually, they can share a secure key that everyone in that cluster can use to then propagate further OGMs without needing individual point-to-point connections. So the entire point here is setting up a form of distributed PKI, so public key infrastructure, but doing it in a lightweight, quick way that can easily collapse back down. Delegated authentication is required because I've already talked about the issue of being oversubscribed. If you have a lot of drones in an area, you will end up with clusters, you'll end up with large amounts of communications flowing over individual drones, especially when you're trying to deal with problems of congestion and use of airspace. As a result, when you're doing key exchange, you've got this standard three-way handshake, so you've got your discovery request, so you propagate an OGM, a drone discovers that you're there. That drone then sends a certificate request back to you. You exchange your certificate with that drone, and then that drone, either if it is the first time two drones in the network have communicated at all, will create and then share a broadcast key, establishing the broadcast key for that network, or it will share its existing held broadcast key, allowing it to then propagate the network and have that shared communication medium for routing as well as the tunnels between individual drones. It will also invalidate any previously held broadcast key to assert the new one. This does lead to a basically an edge conflict scenario in networks where you have multiple broadcast keys propagating towards each other, but for the sake of this discussion I've left that out because I've only got 4 minutes left. Time limits are a thing, so we can always discuss that afterwards, because that is actually the current work, is deconflicting the edges of the networks as they converge to each other and trying to find out whether you're either able to merge networks or form gateways at the borders between them. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is basically what it looks like with the 4 main use cases, which is use case 1 is the easiest, which is new drone contacts another drone and they exchange keys. Scenario 2 is that drone A wants to contact drone C, but doesn't have any credentials for drone C, but drone B holds C's credentials and therefore can forward them directly to A. And so this means you don't have to send certificates all the way down the route. The nearest drone to you that holds the credentials of the drone you are trying to route to can share them with you using the broadcast key to prove that they're a member of the network. And this just becomes increasingly complex. We're just adding more drones and showing that with arbitrary route length, you can reduce it down to a size where basically n, which is however many hops it takes to get to a drone that knows of the existence of the other drone. In many cases, this will actually be 1 in realistic networks. And so your next hop should be aware of the next drone in line, because if it has routed to that drone before and knows where it is, it's been in contact with the drone closest to it that knows its identity and can share its key. And so what should happen is you find that keys propagate one step behind routing. So anyone that's 2 hops away from you should be guaranteed to hold the key of anyone who is 3, 4 or more away from you. And this allows you to cut down the amount of communication it takes to actually perform this. So I'll leave you, we can talk about this later on. I don't want to go into too much detail. We get some advantages over existing IPsec approaches. So we ran some experiments implementing IPsec over a Batman implementation, as well as, in this case, ULSA. And so what we have here is the certificate exchange overhead, so the total bytes transmitted, where we make pretty decent gains over time. As the network grows, our rate of growth is much, much smaller. IPsec's rate of growth is almost cubic. We do still have a scaling problem, but we can manage that through the task allocation method and clustering we talked about earlier, keeping networks small, keeping them contained. So for example, maybe setting an upper limit on how many times you can share a broadcast key. And because we have this slower rate of growth, that means that we can support a larger number of nodes before we're oversubscribing our channel just for routing traffic and security traffic. Using this over ULSA, we gain similar benefits to the Batman scenario. And finally, overheads for CBBA allocations. So we've done unclustered and clustered allocations. And what we found is, by using the Superman approach, we dramatically reduce the security overheads compared to using an existing layer 3 security solution. So you can implement IPsec. There's nothing stopping you from doing this. It is a workable solution. The problem being is your very limited network resources get eaten up very quickly by the requirements of this kind of security. So in summary, we've explored one facet of urban drone swarm security. This has gone on longer than I thought it would, but this is just one facet, and we've only looked at one specific problem, which is you've lost your communications. How do you stop collisions? Decentralized traffic replanning is possible. You already had a plan, now you have to plan again, and you may have to plan dynamically as drones enter and leave space. Drone communication security is non-trivial and cannot be solved merely by encrypting channels. We need to think about where they are in space, our battery problem, and the issue of we need to have our task allocations. We need to have our route home. If we blindly follow our route home because we're low on battery, we're at risk of collision. If we don't have the ability to make plans, then we're stuck in place or have to do sort of possibly dangerous things to try and ensure the safety of the drone itself. So it's really, really vital that we make sure we can do this replanning activity. Infrastructure failure results in significant safety risks. MANETs provide interim communications capability. They're not the be-all and end-all solution, but they do mean that you can make local decisions in a meaningful way and form consensus. And finally, regulatory compliance necessarily emphasizes safety over privacy, but there are privacy considerations that we must consider. This does leave significant personal and organizational concerns, and this will remain an open conversation, because just because we're now we're compliant in a regulatory way, doesn't necessarily mean we're happy with how we're handling data and how we're dealing with potential attacks against privacy. So thank you very much for listening. I'll be open for questions after the next presentation, and I'd like to thank you for your time.